There was a moment in the late 1990s when fat became the enemy of the American household. Not just discouraged, not just limited, eliminated. Shelves that once held whole milk and butter were restocked with products engineered to contain as little fat as possible. The labels said fat-free, low-fat, reduced fat, and for a decade, those words meant health, they meant discipline, they meant you were doing it right. But if you remove fat from food, you remove flavor. And if you remove flavor, people stop eating. So the question the industry faced was simple. How do you make people want to eat something that no longer tastes like food? The answer was sugar. By 1992, the USDA released a food pyramid that became the nutritional blueprint for an entire generation. At its base were grains, 6 to 11 servings a day. At its peak, barely visible, sat fats and oils, to be used sparingly. The message was clear and institutional. It appeared in school cafeterias, doctors' offices, and government-funded campaigns. Eat less fat. Eat more carbohydrates. This will save your heart. The timing aligned with a growing fear. Heart disease had become the leading cause of death in America. Studies linked saturated fat to cholesterol, cholesterol to clogged arteries to death. The logic felt airtight, so the country pivoted. Butter was replaced with margarine, whole milk with skim. Eggs, once a breakfast staple, were treated with suspicion. The yolk, in particular, was seen as a small yellow threat. And the industry responded with speed. Within a few years, nearly every product category had a low-fat alternative. Cookies, chips, salad dressing, cheese, yogurt, peanut butter. Even foods that had never contained much fat were rebranded to highlight their absence of it. The grocery store became a monument to a single idea: fat makes you fat, and fat kills you. It didn't feel like marketing, it felt like medicine. Parents packed lunchboxes with fat-free snacks, believing they were protecting their children. Schools replaced whole milk with 1% or skim following federal guidelines. Restaurants began listing calorie counts and fat grams on menus, and the ones with the lowest numbers were worn like badges. To eat fat was to be reckless. To avoid it was to be informed. This was the deal. Sacrifice flavor, and you'll live longer. But fat had always served a purpose. It slowed digestion. It signaled fullness. It carried vitamins A, D, and K through the body. It gave food a texture that felt satisfying, a richness that made a meal feel complete. When fat was removed, those functions didn't disappear. They were simply left unmet. So the engineers went to work. Sugar was already cheap. Corn syrup, specifically high-fructose corn syrup, had been introduced in the 1970s and quickly became cheaper than cane sugar. It was sweeter, it dissolved easily, it extended shelf life, and crucially, it didn't appear on a label as fat. It appeared as corn syrup, dextrose, maltose, fruit juice concentrate, evaporated cane juice. Names that sounded less threatening, sometimes even natural. A fat-free muffin might contain 29 grams of sugar, a serving of fat-free yogurt, 33, a bottle of fat-free salad dressing, 12. These numbers weren't hidden, but they also weren't emphasized. The front of the package celebrated what had been removed, the back listed what had been added, and most people only read the front. The taste was different, but it was still sweet. Sweetness had always meant reward. It triggered dopamine, the same neurological pathway activated by substances the body recognized as valuable. In evolutionary terms, sweet meant energy, rare and precious. But now it wasn't rare, it was in everything. And the body, which had evolved to seek it out in small doses, suddenly had access to it in every meal. Fat-free didn't mean less, it often meant more. More sugar, more refined carbohydrates, more metabolic confusion. The absence of fat removed the brake on appetite,
and the presence of sugar kept it engaged. People ate more and felt less satisfied. They gained weight on diets designed to prevent it. And no one could understand why.
The numbers began to tell a story the pyramid couldn't explain. In 1990, no state in the US had an obesity rate above 15%. By 2000, 23 states did. By 2010, no state had a rate below 20%. The line on the graph didn't plateau. It didn't fluctuate. It rose steadily, year after year, even as fat consumption dropped and the population followed the guidelines they'd been given. This parallel rise, falling fat intake, skyrocketing obesity, was the paradox that should have triggered a fundamental rethink. Instead, it was often cited as evidence of personal failing, a collective lack of willpower in the face of abundant, healthy choices. Type 2 diabetes, once called adult-onset diabetes, began appearing in children. By the early 2000s, pediatric endocrinologists were treating cases in patients as young as 8. The condition, which had been rare in anyone under 40, became common in adolescence. The term adult onset was quietly retired. It no longer fit. This shift wasn't merely semantic, it marked a biological sea change. Children's metabolisms, designed for growth and activity, were being aged prematurely by a constant, insidious glucose overload, straining pancreatic function from a point in life where it should have been most resilient. Metabolic syndrome, a cluster of conditions including high blood pressure, high blood sugar, and excess abdominal fat, became a diagnosis applied to nearly 1 in 3 American adults. Fatty liver disease, previously associated with alcoholism, began showing up in people who didn't drink. The liver, overwhelmed by fructose it couldn't process fast enough, started storing it as fat. This condition, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, became the silent internal monument to the low-fat era. Unlike subcutaneous fat, this visceral fat encased organs, pumping out inflammatory signals and exacerbating insulin resistance, creating a vicious cycle that dieting alone couldn't break. The medical community noticed, but the guidance didn't change. The pyramid stayed in place until 2011, when it was replaced by a plate. The plate reduced the emphasis on grains and added more vegetables, but it still treated fat with caution. The messaging softened, but it didn't reverse. Institutional inertia is a powerful force. To reverse course would have meant dismantling a vast, interconnected ecosystem of dietary education, agricultural subsidies, particularly for corn and wheat, and product formulations that had been built over a generation. Because reversing would have required an admission that the advice had been wrong, that the substitution of fat with sugar had caused harm, that an entire generation had been shaped by a mistake made with confidence and repeated with institutional weight. It would have meant acknowledging that the public health establishment, however well-intentioned, had been an unwitting accomplice in a massive, uncontrolled experiment on the national diet. And by then, the taste had changed. Children raised on fat-free diets grew into adults who preferred the sweetness. The palate adapted. Whole milk tasted heavy. Butter tasted rich in a way that felt excessive. An apple, once sweet on its own, now tasted plain unless paired with caramel. The benchmark shifted. Food that wasn't engineered felt inadequate. This wasn't just a preference, it was a rewiring. The constant high-level stimulation of sweet receptors raised the threshold for what the brain registered as flavorful or rewarding, making whole, minimally processed foods seem bland by comparison. The very definition of normal food had been altered. The culture changed too. Eating became a matter of control, willpower, morality. People who gained weight were assumed to lack discipline, even if they'd followed every recommendation. The idea that the system itself might be flawed was harder to accept than the idea that individuals were failing. So the blame turned inward. Diets became stricter, portions smaller, exercise more intense, and still the weight didn't come off. This internalization of failure created a secondary epidemic of shame and anxiety around food. The dinner table became a minefield of guilt, and the act of eating, which should have been a source of nourishment and pleasure, was reframed as a constant test of character. Because the problem wasn't effort, it was substitution. It took decades for the research to catch up. Studies began to show that saturated fat, the kind found in butter and eggs and meat, wasn't the villain it had been made out to be. That cholesterol in food didn't translate directly to cholesterol in blood. That the body needed fat to function, and that removing it created gaps the body tried to fill with whatever was available. And what was available was sugar. In 2015, an investigation revealed that in the 1960s, the sugar industry had paid scientists to downplay the risks of sugar and emphasize the dangers of fat. Internal documents showed the funding, the influence, the shaping of public perception through research that looked independent but wasn't. The low-fat movement, it turned out, had roots in something other than science. But by then, the damage was generational. An entire population had been conditioned to fear the wrong thing, to replace something the body needed with something it couldn't handle in those quantities. The consequences weren't immediate. They unfolded slowly, a pound at a time, a diagnosis at a time, a decade at a time. And the companies that had profited from the transition, those that had reformulated their products to be fat-free and sugar-loaded, didn't issue apologies. They issued new products, low sugar, low carb, keto-friendly. The market shifted again, this time in reverse, and the same corporations that had sold the problem now sold the solution. The cycle continued. There's a grocery store today where you can still find fat-free cookies. They sit next to the organic ones, the gluten-free ones, the ones made with coconut sugar or almond flour or no sugar at all. The options have multiplied, the promises have diversified, but the shape of the aisle is the same. Somewhere in the back of that store, there's whole milk again, real butter, eggs that don't come with a warning. They're often more expensive now, sometimes labeled artisan or heritage or pasture-raised, as if the original version of food had become the luxury. The low-fat era didn't end with an announcement. It faded, slowly, quietly, replaced with new concerns, new frameworks, new enemies. But the people who lived through it, who grew up on skim milk and fat-free snacks and the belief that they were doing everything right, they're still here. And so are the consequences. This was sold as progress, and for a long time it was believed. But progress, it turned out, was just another word for substitution. And substitution always costs something. It's just not always clear what until the bill comes due. This is only one chapter. There are others.